The Legend of Saint Galonnek by Anonymous. Saint Galonnek was a native of Ireland, as indeed were almost all the teachers in Brittany of those days, and called himself Galonus, being evidently of Roman origin. But after he had left his native land, and the fame of his good deeds had spread far and wide, the Bretons, seeing that his heart was like one of those fresh springs of water that are ever bubbling beneath unfading verdure, changed his name to Galonnek, which signifies in their language the open-hearted. And in truth, never had any child of God a soul more tenderly awakened to the sufferings of his fellow men. No sorrow was beneath his sympathy, but it was like the sea breeze springing with each tide, never failing to refresh the traveler weary on his way, or to fill the sails of the humble fishing boat and bring it safe to land. His father and mother were people of substance, and though themselves buried in the darkness of paganism, spared not the tenderest solicitude in the education of their son. He was placed under the instruction of the most learned masters Ireland could afford, and above all, had the honor of being a pupil of St. Patrick, then 15, found amongst them like a nightingale in the midst of wrens, or a beech tree towering above the ferns on a common. Under his teaching, the boy grew up learning only to regard himself in the person of God and his neighbors, and with so fervent a love for souls did the holy apostle of Ireland inspire Galonnek, that at the age of 18, he had no higher wish than to cross over to Brittany and preach the kingdom of heaven to sorrowful sinners. His father and mother, who had then long since been converted, desired to throw no hindrance in the way of his accomplishing this pious work, but embracing him with tears, they bade him Godspeed, assured that they should meet again once more before the throne of God. Galonnek took his passage in a boat manned by evil-disposed sailors whose design was to plunder him, but when they discovered that the holy youth was possessed of nothing but an iron crucifix and a hollow-staff, they turned him out upon the coast of Cornwall, where they abandoned him helpless and without provisions. Galonnek walked about a long time, not knowing where he was, but perfectly tranquil in his mind, certain that he was in his master's kingdom, the sea that roared behind him, the birds that warbled in the bushes, and the wind, murmuring 16 in the leaves, all spoke alike to him, each with its own peculiar voice, the name of that master, whose creatures and subjects they were. He came at length towards evening to a part of the country lying between Audiern and Plougastelda's Montagnes, and there finding a village, he seated himself on the doorstep of the first house, awaiting an invitation to enter. But far from that, the owner of the house bade him rise and go away. Galonnek then went to the door of the next house, and received the same inhospitable order, and so on from door to door throughout the village. And from the expression everywhere used to him, Zevil, this village was afterwards called Plouzeville, literally people who said get up. The saint was preparing to stretch his weary limbs by the roadside when he perceived a cabin which he had not yet noticed, and drew near the door. It was the dwelling of a poor widow, possessed only of a few acres of barren land, which she had no longer strength to till. But if the fruits of her land were little worth, those of her heart were rich and plentiful. So tenderly generous was her charity, that if anyone asked her for a draught of goat's milk, she would give him cream, and if one begged for cream, she would have been ready to bestow the goat itself 17. She received Galonnek as if he had been her dearly beloved son, long absent and supposed dead. She ministered to him of the best she had, listening with devotion to his holy teaching, and having already charity, the very key of true religion, she was ready to embrace with all her heart the faith of Christ, so early as the very next morning she begged the grace of baptism. And Galonnek, seeing that the love of her neighbors had already made her a Christian in intention, consented to bestow it, but water was wanted at the moment of the ceremony, and St. Galonnek, going out, took a spade, and digging for a few moments in the old woman's little courtyard, there sprung out an abundant fountain, and he said, "By the aid of this water, your barren land will become fertile meadows covered with rich grass, and you will be able to feed as many cows in your new pastures as you have now goats browsing on your heath." This miracle began to open the eyes of the villagers, and they gave permission to Galonnek to take up his abode in a forest which stretched in those days from Plouzeville to the seashore. There, the holy disciple of St. Patrick built himself a hut of turf and boughs. One day, whilst praying in this oratory, he heard the hoofs of a runaway horse, and leaving his devotions to see what was the matter, he 18 saw a knight thrown from his horse amidst the thicket. Galonnek ran to his assistance, and having with much difficulty carried him to his hermitage, he began to bathe his wounds, to dress them with leaves for want of ointment, and to bind them up with strips torn from his own gown of serge. Now it chanced that this knight was the Count of Cornwall himself, and he was found presently by the attendants whom he had outstripped peacefully sleeping on the saint's bed of fern. But behold, when he awakened, that saint's prayers had stood instead of remedies, and all his wounds were healed. And whilst all stood astonished at this miracle, St. Galonnek said gently, "Do not be so much surprised, for, if by faith mountains may be moved, why should not charity heal death itself?" The Count, filled with wonder and delight, declared that the whole forest should become the property of the man who had done so much for him, and not that only, but that he should have as much good meadowland as could be enclosed within the strips he had torn from his gown to bind the wounds, each strip being reduced to single threads. Thus Galonnek became the owner of a whole parish, and a proverb arose 19, which is still current in those parts, that it is with the length of a benefit received one must measure the field of gratitude. Yet Galonnek was none the richer, notwithstanding the noble liberality of the Count. All the income of his estate was given to the poor whilst he still lived on in his leafy hermitage. But as many young men were attracted from the neighborhood by his reputation for holiness and learning, he built many other cells beside his own. And thus from his school, in that solitary glade, the light of the gospel went forth in time through all the length and breadth of the country. It was amidst the perfume of wildflowers, beside the murmuring brook, that Galonnek taught his pupils. He would teach them to understand somewhat of the providence of God, by making them observe the tender care with which the little birds prepare a downy nest for offspring. Yet unborn, he would point out to their attention how the earth yields moisture to the roots of trees, how the trees become a dwelling place for thrushes and for finches, and how these again make musical the forest with their cheerful strains, to illustrate the advantage and necessity of mutual benevolence and brotherly love. And when need was to stimulate their efforts or their perseverance, he would lead them to 20. Behold the ant unwearied in her toil, or the constant woodpecker, whose tiny bill achieves the scooping of an oak. But this teaching did not confine him in one place, and wherever he went his presence was as that of a star in the midst of darkness. Now in those days, the inhabitants of Brittany still exercised the right of wrecking, or in other words reserved to themselves, the privilege of plundering any unfortunate vessels thrown upon their coasts. They spoke of the sea as a cow given to their ancestors by God, and that brought forth every winter for their benefit. Thus they looked on shipwrecks as a positive blessing. One night during a heavy storm, as Galonnek was returning to his forest from the sickbed of a poor man, he saw the dwellers on the coast leading a bull along the rocks. His head was bound down towards his forelegs, and a beacon light was fastened to his horns. The crippled gait of the animal gave an oscillating motion to the light, which might be well mistaken at a distance for the lantern of a ship pitching out at sea, and thus deceive bewildered vessels uncertain in the tempest of their course into the notion of yet being far from shore already. One thus treacherously beguiled was on its way to ruin, and might be seen close upon the rocks, its full 21 white sails gleaming through the night another moment, and it would have been aground among the breakers. Galonnek rushed amidst the peasants, extinguished the false beacon, and reproached them for such treachery, but they would not listen to him, and prepared to rekindle the light. Then the saint cried, "By all your hopes in this world and the next have done for it, is your own brethren and children that you are drawing to destruction." And whilst they stood uncertain, God kindled up the sky with flashing lightning, and beholding the vessel, as if it had been noonday, they saw that it was indeed a Breton ship. Terrified by the dangers to which they had exposed themselves, they all fell down at the saint's feet. The women kissed the hem of his garment with floods of tears, as if his hands had rescued their sons from the depths of the sea, and all with one voice exclaimed, "But for him, we should have become the murderers of our friends and neighbors." "Alas, those whom you have already lured to death were equally your neighbors and your friends," replied St. Galonnek, for we are all descended from Adam, and have been ransomed by the blood of the same God. 22. The peasants, deeply moved, perceived their guilt, and promised to renounce this custom of their fathers. Much about the same time, the country of Plugafant was ravaged by a dragon, which devoured whole flocks, with their shepherds and dogs in vain. Had the most courageous men banded themselves together to destroy it, the ferocious monster had put them all to flight, and now nobody dared to stir out of doors to lead his cattle to water or go and work in the fields. As soon as Galonnek knew this sad state of things, he set out for the court of the Count of Cornwall, and asked there which knight was the most valiant before God and man. Every voice declared him to be Messer Tangai de Carfer, who had made a pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre, and killed more than 1,000 Saracens with his own hand. Galonnek desired him to gird on his sword and armor, and to come and fight the dragon, which God had given him a mission to destroy. Carfer instantly armed himself, and accompanied the saint to the monster's den, from which he came out howling frightfully at their approach. Carfer hesitated in spite of himself at so unwanted an appearance, but Galonnek said to him, "For your soul's sake, Messer, have confidence 23 in God, and you shall kill this monster as easily as a gadfly." Thus encouraged, the knight advanced to the attack, and with scarce an effort pierced the dragon 3 times through with his sword, whilst the saint called upon the 3 persons of the most holy Trinity. Galonnek also freed the country from many other scourges, such as wolves, reptiles, and mosquitoes with fiery stings, and being now old enough to receive holy orders, he was ordained by St. Paul and built a little chapel beside his oratory, where every day he celebrated Mass. Meanwhile, the leafy cells around him multiplied so fast that at last they were united in a monastery called by Galonnek Yalmud, or the House of Good Desires. He was engaged in drawing up a rule for this monastery when he was interrupted by a disturbing rumor which arose in the neighborhood. It was said that a woman clothed in red and with a ghastly countenance had taken passage in a fishing boat from Crozon. She landed near Powlands, and when questioned as to her name on departing, she had replied that she was called the Lady of Pestilence, and in fact it came to pass that within a very few days both men and animals were smitten with a contagious disease, which carried them off after a few hours' illness. 24. So great was the mortality that wood sufficient for the coffins could not be found, and for want of gravediggers, the corpses were laid to rest in furrows hollowed by the plough. Those who were well off gathered all their effects together in wagons, and harnessing all the horses they possessed drove away at full speed to the mountains, which the pallid woman had not passed, but the poorer people who had no means of conveyance, and were unwilling to leave their little all, awaited their doom at home like sheep, lying down to rest around the butcher's door. In this extremity, however, they were not abandoned by Galonnek. He went from hut to hut carrying aid or consolation. Linen for shrouds and wood for coffins might indeed be wanting, but he swathed the fever-spotted dead in leafy twigs and bore them in his own arms to consecrated earth, laying them down tenderly as sleeping infants in their cradled. Then planting a branch of yew and another of blossoming broom, he entwined them in the form of a cross, and set them as an emblem on the grave, the yew symbolizing the sorrow which underlies the whole course of life, and the blossoming broom the transitory joys which gleam across it. And it is said that when at last the pestilence was stayed, these holy crosses covered a space of 325 days' journey. So many generous and pious acts had spread the fame of Galonnek both far and wide, and all Cornwall was inflamed with devotion. Persons came from all parts to the convent of Good Desires to listen to his teaching, to ask his prayers, and to offer him gifts, but these the saint only accepted for the purposes of charity. The priest, he used to say, is only as a canal, which serves to carry water from overflowing streams to arid, barren plains. Another of his sayings was, God has given us 2 hands, one with which to receive his good treasures, and the other to administer the same to those who need. And thus, although the neighboring nobles had loaded him with presents, his monastery and church were radiant only with his good actions. He was accustomed to sleep upon an osier hurdle, and wore nothing better than a gown of faded serge. But all this external poverty threw out with stronger luster the brightness of his hidden worth, and Galonnek was like one of those caskets made of earth or bark, in which are treasured rubies and carbuncles. The see of Cornwall becoming vacant, Galonnek was summoned with one voice to fill it. He was anxious to refuse, but St. Paul himself came to find him out, and said to him that God's stars have no right to conceal themselves in the 26 grass, but must take their places in the firmament. Then St. Galonnek resigned himself, but when the moment came for leaving the turf and oratory, where he had spent the best part of his life, his heart became so heavy that he burst into tears and cried aloud, "Alas, how shall I become worthy of the new office which my brethren impose upon me?" Then falling on his knees, he prayed most fervently, until God put strength into his heart. When he arose, he took the humble chalice. He had been accustomed to use his sole possession save the memory of his good deeds, and went on foot to the capital of Cornwall, where he was consecrated bishop. Here began for St. Galonnek a new life of courage and self-denial. He had to fight for the poor against the rich, for the weak against the mighty, when his friends and disciples beheld him engage, all unprotected, in these dangerous struggles. Even the most courageous were at times dismayed. But Galonnek would say with a smile, "Fear not, my friends, their weapons cannot touch me. God himself has forged for me a breastplate with the tears of the sorrowful, the miseries of the poor, and the despair of the oppressed behind this armor. I can feel no hurt. Blows can only do us mischief by glancing across us at any of those who have taken up our cause, for from our very heart distills a balsam that can 27 heal, as they come all the wounds inflicted from without." Moved by the sight of so much virtue, many powerful noblemen who had hitherto persisted in idolatry came to ask of Galonnek instruction and the grace of baptism. But he would only grant this favor in reward for some good work. If anyone had sinned and came to seek for absolution, Galonnek would give him for a penance some virtuous action, to perform some charitable service to his fellow men. He taught them to regard God as the surety for recompenses merited, but not received, to invest their lives in paradise, to break every tie which holds the soul in bondage, that it may spring forward with unfettered flight in the love of God and man. About this time, the Count of Cornwall died, and was succeeded by his son Tugduval. He was a conceited, vainglorious youth, who could not endure the least contradiction, and had not yet lived long enough to find that life is an instrument on which the first chords we strike are invariably false. So unjust had he shown himself in many instances to the townspeople and gentry that they banded together and drove him from the city. But Tugduval asked assistance from the Count of Vannes, and soon returned with an army to which the rebels could offer no resistance. 28 multitudes were slain in battle, and the survivors, taking refuge in the city, were besieged there by the Count. He rode round the city walls like a hungry wolf, parading a sheepfold, swearing never to forgive one of the rebels or those who had given them shelter. So batterangrams were brought and raised against the walls, and when once a passage was forced, he mounted his war-horse, and ordering every soldier to take a naked sword in one hand and a lighted torch in the other, he rushed at their head into the affrighted city. But Galonnek had seen the terror of the conquered people, who only looked for fire and sword, and coming out of the cathedral with all his priests in procession, bearing crosses and all their sacred relics, he came the first to meet Tugduval, his bald head uncovered, and his chalice in his hand. The young count, astonished, checked his horse, but Galonnek went straight up to his saddlebow there, paused, and said in a gentle voice, "If any will devour the flock, he must begin by slaying the shepherd. I am here at your mercy, and am ready to purchase with my blood forgiveness for the rest." At the sight of this holy old man, whom he had early been taught to reverence, and at that 29 voice, which had always sounded like a benediction, Tugduval felt his rage dissolve away, and letting fall his sword, he bent over his horse's neck, and kissed devoutly the chalice carried by St. Galonnek. At that instant all the soldiers, as if touched by the same emotion, put out their torches, and turned their sword-points to the ground, crying, as with one voice, "Quarter, quarter for all." The young count waited not a repetition of this prayer, but dismounting hastily, he followed the bishop to the cathedral, where the conquerors and the conquered joined in songs of thanksgiving to God. This was the last great act of St. Galonnek's life, a very few months after he felt his strength decay, and knew that his end was near. He did not, however, on that account relax in his good works. Returning one day from a visit to a poor widow bereaved of her last son, he suddenly found himself unable to proceed, and sat down to rest upon a stone by the wayside. There a peddler from the mountains found him some time after sitting motionless, and thinking that he slept, the man approached him, when he saw that he was dead. Judging from the poverty of his apparel, the peddler took him for a hermit of the neighborhood, and out of Christian charity wrapped the body in his mantle for a funeral shroud. A shoemaker's wife, who lived a few steps off, contributed 30 an old chest to serve as a coffin, so that Bishop Galonnek came to his grave like a beggar. But the truth was soon discovered by the miracles which were wrought at his tomb, and the body being taken from the earth was carried with great state to the city, and buried at the foot of the high altar in the cathedral. St. Paul was requested to write an epitaph upon him, but the Apostle of Leon replied that none but an archangel could compose one, so they merely covered the grave with a plain granite slab on which was carved the name of Galonnek. Ages have passed away, and yet this stone still remains, and thither the Breton mothers come to lay their newborn babes one instant on its consecrated bosom, whilst they repeat the usual form of prayer. Saint Galonnek, bestow upon my child 2 hearts, give him the heart of a lion, that he may be strong in well-doing, and give him the heart of a turtle-dove, that he may be full of brotherly love. The feast of St. Galonnek is celebrated on the 1st of April, when the buds of the hedgerows are bursting into leaf, and the time of the singing of birds is come 31.